I heard myself saying goodbye on a recording from a plane that crashed 40 years ago. Those were the exact words spoken by aviation engineer Thomas Keller after analyzing the black box from Southern Atlantic Airways Flight 714, a flight that disappeared without a trace in 1982, a flight he never boarded. Keller, with 37 years of experience in aviation engineering and black box analysis, had reviewed countless recordings throughout his career, but nothing could have prepared him for what he discovered in the abandoned archives of the National Transportation Safety Board. Before we go deeper, make sure to subscribe now. This channel exposes aviation mysteries and forbidden reports the industry tries to hide. The recordings you're about to hear were sealed for 4 decades, and for good reason. Turn on notifications so you don't miss our next investigation into the darkest corners of aviation history. It began on a rainy Tuesday morning in March 2021. The NTSB had recently digitized their archives of unsolved cases, and Keller was tasked with reviewing old black box recordings that might benefit from modern analytical techniques. The assignment was routine until he came across Flight 714. Southern Atlantic Airways no longer exists today. Once a mid-sized carrier operating routes primarily along the eastern seaboard, the airline filed for bankruptcy in 1987. 5 years after the disappearance of Flight 714, an event many industry insiders believe contributed significantly to the company's financial downfall. The Boeing 727 was scheduled to depart from Miami International Airport at 11:15 p.m. on June 7, 1982, bound for Boston Logan International with 73 passengers and 6 crew members. Weather conditions were clear, with light winds and excellent visibility. The aircraft had passed its maintenance check just 4 days prior, with no significant issues reported. According to the flight manifest, the plane took off at 11:27 p.m., 12 minutes behind schedule due to routine ground traffic. Air traffic control maintained normal communication with Flight 714 until 1:17 a.m., at which point the aircraft was approximately 140 miles east of Charleston, South Carolina. Then, without warning or distress signal, radar contact was lost. That's standard procedure for reviewing a cold case, Keller explained. You familiarize yourself with the basic facts before examining the black box data. Nothing about Flight 714 seemed particularly unusual at first glance, just another tragic disappearance that predated modern tracking technology. What made this case notable was that parts of the wreckage, including one of the flight recorders, had been recovered 2 years after the disappearance, when a commercial fishing vessel dragged up debris from nearly 300 feet below the surface. Despite this partial recovery, the majority of the aircraft and the victim's remains were never found. The cockpit voice recorder had sustained significant damage, and the technology of the early 1980s couldn't salvage much from the waterlogged tape. The case was officially classified as probable controlled flight into water due to spatial disorientation, a sterile phrase that essentially means the pilots, for unknown reasons, inadvertently flew a perfectly functional aircraft into the ocean. These old recordings are often frustrating, Keller noted. Water damage, tape degradation, background noise. Sometimes you're lucky to hear anything at all, but modern digital filtering can work wonders. Keller began the standard procedure of transferring the original audio to the NTSB's current analysis system, applying filters to remove ocean noise, tape hiss, and electrical interference. For the first hour of the recording, there was nothing unusual. Routine cockpit conversation, standard communications with air traffic control, discussions about weather and fuel consumption. But at approximately 1:15 a.m., 2 minutes before radar contact was lost, the tone of the recording changed. I've heard pilots in crisis before, Keller said, his voice noticeably tense during our interview. There's a particular quality to human speech when someone is facing imminent death, a tightness, a controlled panic. But what I heard on Flight 714 wasn't panic. It was confusion. The transcript begins with Captain Robert Hendricks saying, "That can't be right," followed by First Officer David Lang asking, "What's wrong?" The captain responds, "Check the fuel gauges. Are you seeing this?" For 18 seconds, there's the sound of switches being flipped and buttons being pressed. Then the captain says, "Control, this is Southern 714. We're showing an instantaneous fuel loss in all tanks. Request immediate. The transmission cuts off suddenly, followed by a sound that Keller initially could not identify, a low-frequency hum that seemed to oscillate in an irregular pattern. This continued for approximately 45 seconds. When voices returned to the recording, they were distorted. The pilot's words became stretched and warped, as if the tape itself was being physically manipulated during playback. Yet this was digital audio now, converted from the original. There was no tape to manipulate. At first, I thought it was just damage to the original recording, Keller explained. Water can do strange things to magnetic tape, so I applied additional filters, tried to clean it up further. That's when things took a turn toward the inexplicable. As Keller enhanced the audio, separating frequencies and isolating voice patterns, he began to hear conversations that weren't possible. The pilots were discussing events that occurred after 1982. They mentioned the Challenger disaster, which happened in 1986, Keller said, still visibly shaken as he recalled the details. Then there was a reference to someone using an iPhone. The first iPhone wasn't released until 2007. Most disturbing of all was a voice in the background, faint but distinct, that Keller recognized as his own. I heard myself saying, "Don't open the cockpit door. Whatever happens, keep it locked." But I never said that. I was never on that flight. I was 22 years old in 1982, still in engineering school, thousands of miles away in California. Keller's initial reaction was completely rational. He assumed he was suffering from audio pareidolia, the phenomenon where the human brain interprets random sounds as familiar patterns, like hearing words in static or music in running water. He decided to bring in a colleague, Dr. Eliza Hansen, an audio forensic specialist with no prior knowledge of the case. "I didn't tell her what I thought I'd heard," Keller insisted. "I just asked her to clean up the recording and tell me what she could make out." 3 hours later, Dr. Hansen emerged from her lab, pale and visibly disturbed. "There's something wrong with this recording, Tom," she said. "I hear you on it. You're warning the pilots about something." The two experts independently hearing the same impossibility eliminated the possibility of simple pareidolia. Something far stranger was happening with Flight 714's black box. Working together, Keller and Hansen spent the next 72 hours analyzing every second of the recording. What they discovered defies conventional explanation. After the strange humming sound, the cockpit voice recorder had somehow captured conversations that occurred in multiple different time periods. Some from the actual flight in 1982, others from what appeared to be alternate versions of the same flight occurring in different decades. One segment included a pilot referencing President Harris and mentioning the year 2025. Another described passing through the Aurora while passengers screamed in the background. Most chilling was a calm, almost resigned conversation between the pilots as they apparently flew through what they described as just emptiness now. No stars, no lights below. And throughout these impossible time-shifted conversations was Keller's voice, sometimes instructing the pilots, sometimes arguing with them, and finally, in the last audible segment, saying goodbye. "My exact words were, 'This is where I get off. Good luck, gentlemen. I'm sorry I couldn't save you this time either," Keller recounted, his professional composure finally breaking. Then there's the sound of what might be a door opening and closing, followed by the captain saying, "He's gone. Again." The recording ends 30 seconds later with a sudden rush of static. Dr. Hansen's analysis confirmed that the voice was indeed Keller's, matching his vocal patterns, speech cadence, and frequency range with 97% certainty. The only difference was that the voice on the recording sounded older, more weathered than Keller's current voice. "It was me, but older than I am now," Keller stated. "Like a version of me from the future." The implications were so disturbing that both engineers initially agreed to keep their findings confidential while they pursued further analysis. They brought in Dr. Raymond Chen, a theoretical physicist from MIT with security clearance for sensitive government projects. Dr. Chen's assessment was blunt and unsettling. "What you're describing shouldn't be possible under our current understanding of physics. But if I had to propose a theory, I'd suggest you're hearing evidence of what we call a closed time-like curve, essentially a loop in space-time. According to Dr. Chen, certain extreme conditions, perhaps involving electromagnetic anomalies or gravitational distortions, might create situations where time doesn't flow linearly. In such scenarios, cause and effect become untethered from their normal sequence. Think of it like a vinyl record with a scratch, Dr. Chen explained. The needle keeps jumping back to the same groove, playing the same few seconds of music over and over. But each time, the groove gets slightly more worn, so the music sounds a little different. If time worked that way, you might have events that repeat with slight variations. The theory suggests that Flight 714 may have become trapped in such a loop, crashing, then somehow resetting to some point before the crash, then crashing again, over and over, with slight variations each time. And somehow, in one of these iterations, an older version of Thomas Keller was aboard. But that's impossible, Keller insisted. I've never been on that flight in any capacity. Not in this timeline, Dr. Chen responded, but perhaps in another iteration of the loop, you were. The three experts decided to dig deeper into the flight's history. They discovered something odd. Southern Atlantic Airways Flight 714 had actually been scheduled to depart from Miami International twice before, on June 7, 1972, and June 7, 1962. Both times, the flight was canceled due to mechanical issues discovered during pre-flight checks. It's like the flight was destined to happen, Dr. Hansen observed. And when it was prevented twice, it finally took off in 1982. But the strangest discovery came when Keller accessed his own family records. His grandfather, Thomas Keller Sr., had worked as a maintenance engineer for Southern Atlantic Airways from 1960 to 1975. And, according to company records, he was the technician who identified the critical issues that led to the cancellation of Flight 714 in 1972. "My grandfather saved that flight," Keller whispered as he stared at the maintenance log bearing his family name. And somehow, 40 years later, a future version of me was trying to save it, too. The team's research took an even darker turn when they expanded their search to include other aircraft disappearances with similar profiles, commercial flights that vanished without distress calls, in good weather, with experienced crews. They identified 7 cases between 1952 and 2012 that fit the pattern. In each case, the flights disappeared over water, and in each case, the flights had been scheduled and canceled at least once before on the exact same date in previous decades. Most disturbing of all, when partial wreckage was recovered from these crashes, the cockpit voice recorders, if found, were always too damaged to yield useful information. Flight 714 was the only exception. It's as if something doesn't want us to hear what happens on these flights, Dr. Hansen suggested. Flight 714's recorder was damaged too, but just happened to preserve this one impossible segment. 3 months into their investigation, the team was approached by a retired air traffic controller named Michael Brennan, who had been on duty the night Flight 714 disappeared. Brennan had recently been diagnosed with terminal cancer and claimed he had information he couldn't take to his grave. "I never reported this because I knew no one would believe me," Brennan told them. But right before we lost radar contact with Flight 714, there was something else on the screen. According to Brennan, he briefly observed 2 radar signatures occupying the exact same coordinates as Flight 714, as if 2 identical aircraft were somehow in the same place at the same time. The second signature appeared for only 4 seconds before both disappeared simultaneously. "I thought it was equipment malfunction," Brennan explained. "We ran diagnostics immediately afterward, but everything checked out normal. There was nothing wrong with the radar." When Keller played a segment of the enhanced recording for Brennan, the retired controller turned ashen. "That's not possible," he whispered. "I heard that transmission, but it didn't come through our radio. It came through my headset after the plane had already disappeared from radar." Brennan claimed that approximately 3 minutes after losing contact with Flight 714, he heard a voice through his headset that simply said, "Don't try to find us. We're still trying to fix it." He recognized it as Captain Hendrick's voice, but there was no recording of this transmission in the official logs. "I thought I was losing my mind," Brennan admitted. "I never told anyone until now." The investigation took yet another bizarre turn when Dr. Chen discovered a classified military report from 1983 detailing unusual electromagnetic readings recorded by a Navy vessel approximately 120 miles off the coast of Charleston on the night of June 7, 1982, almost exactly where Flight 714 had disappeared. The report described a localized magnetic anomaly approximately 2,000 feet in diameter that persisted for nearly 6 hours. Radio communications were impossible within this zone, and the ship's navigation systems failed completely while inside the affected area. Most notably, the crew reported extreme time dilation effects, watches running at different speeds, chronometers disagreeing with each other, and crew members experiencing what they described as time confusion, an inability to accurately gauge how much time had passed. The official explanation was equipment malfunction due to unusual atmospheric conditions, but the report included a classified addendum that the team couldn't access. Armed with this new information, Keller made a formal request to the Department of Defense for any additional information related to the coordinates where Flight 714 disappeared. The response was immediate and concerning. 2 uniformed military officers arrived at the NTSB lab the following day and confiscated all materials related to the investigation, including the enhanced recordings. They said it was a matter of national security, Keller recalled. They took everything, our notes, our analysis, the original black box, and told us the matter was classified. But Keller had anticipated this possibility and had already secured a backup of the most important segments of the enhanced recording on a personal device. What he didn't know was whether this act of foresight would put him in danger. For several weeks, the team maintained a low profile, uncertain about how to proceed. Then, Keller received an unmarked envelope containing a single page with a set of coordinates and a date, July 3, 2021, just 2 weeks away. The coordinates pointed to a location in the Atlantic Ocean, approximately 140 miles east of Charleston, virtually identical to where Flight 714 had disappeared. Accompanying the coordinates was a handwritten note. "You're going to be there. You already were." The handwriting matched Keller's own. "That's when I knew," Keller said quietly. "Whatever happened to Flight 714 wasn't just in the past. It was going to happen again, and somehow I was involved." Against the urgent advice of both Dr. Hansen and Dr. Chen, Keller chartered a private boat for July 3rd, determined to reach the coordinates and perhaps find answers. The captain was reluctant when Keller couldn't provide a reason for traveling to a seemingly random point in the Atlantic, but eventually agreed when offered triple his usual rate. As they approached the coordinates early on the morning of July 3rd, the boat's electronics began to malfunction. First the radio, then the GPS, and finally the engine itself sputtered and died, leaving them drifting approximately half a mile from the exact location. "The sky looked wrong," Keller described. "It was clear blue directly above us, but toward the horizon in every direction there was a kind of darkening, like a storm was forming in a perfect circle around us." What happened next defies rational explanation. According to Keller, the surface of the ocean approximately 1,000 yards from their position began to distort, as if the water itself was being stretched and compressed. Then, impossibly, the bow of an aircraft emerged from the water, not from beneath the surface, but somehow from within the water itself, as if passing through a membrane between 2 different spaces. It was a Boeing 727 in Southern Atlantic Airways livery, Keller stated, his voice barely above a whisper. The front half of the aircraft emerged from this distortion and then froze in place, half in our world and half somewhere else. The boat captain, panicking, attempted to restart the engine without success. For 11 minutes, according to Keller's watch, the aircraft remained suspended in this impossible state. Then, a door on the side of the fuselage opened. A man climbed out and stood on the wing, Keller recounted. He was too far away to see clearly, but he seemed to be looking directly at me. He raised his hand, like he was waving. Then he climbed back inside, the door closed, and the aircraft reversed. It pulled back into the distortion and disappeared. Moments later, the boat's engine spontaneously restarted, and all electronic systems returned to normal. By the time they returned to shore, the captain was already convincing himself he had experienced some sort of hallucination caused by heat or dehydration. But Keller knew what he had seen. When he returned home, there was another unmarked envelope waiting for him. Inside was a single black and white photograph showing a Boeing 727 with its front half emerging from what appeared to be a rippling distortion in the ocean surface. Standing on the wing was a man who, despite the image's graininess, was unmistakably an older version of Thomas Keller. On the back of the photograph was written, June 7, 1992. The third iteration. We're still trying. Keller immediately contacted Dr. Chen, who arrived at his home within hours. After examining the photograph and hearing Keller's account, the physicist offered a theory so outlandish that it shouldn't have been coming from a respected scientist. I believe Flight 714 is trapped in what we might call a temporal eddy, Dr. Chen explained, a localized disturbance in space-time that creates a closed loop. The flight keeps taking off on June 7th and keeps crashing, but each cycle occurs 10 years apart in our linear experience of time, 1962, 1972, 1982, and so on. According to this theory, the flight had been saved twice, canceled in 62 and 72 due to mechanical issues discovered in pre-flight checks. But in 1982, there was no last-minute discovery, and the flight took off, only to encounter the temporal anomaly and crash. But it didn't just crash once, Dr. Chen continued. It's been crashing again and again, cycling through different iterations. And at some point in the future, you, Thomas Keller, join the flight, perhaps in an attempt to break the cycle. This would explain the impossibility of Keller hearing his own older voice on the 1982 black box recording. The future Keller had somehow boarded one of the iterations of Flight 714 and was present during its final moments. But why would I do that? Keller demanded. Why would I put myself on a doomed flight? Dr. Chen had no answer, but Dr. Hansen, who had joined them by this point, offered a chilling possibility. Maybe because you've already done it, she suggested. Think about it. Your grandfather saved the flight in 72 by finding a mechanical issue. Maybe in some future iteration, you realize the only way to break the cycle was from inside. The team spent the following months discreetly researching similar anomalies and temporal theories, careful to avoid attracting further attention from the authorities who had confiscated their original work. They discovered a disturbing pattern of repeating incidents throughout aviation history, crashes and disappearances that seemed to follow 10-year cycles. Then, in January 2022, Keller received a third envelope. This one contained a complete passenger manifest for Southern Atlantic Airways Flight 714, scheduled to depart Miami for Boston on June 7, 2022. The flight number had been reused, despite the original Flight 714's disappearance 40 years earlier. On the manifest, highlighted in yellow, was the name Dr. Thomas Keller. That's when I understood, Keller told us in what would be our final interview. I'm not going to try to break the cycle in some future iteration. I'm going to try in the next one, just a few months from now. Despite our urging, Keller refused to consider the possibility that the manifest was a hoax or that boarding the flight would be tantamount to suicide. He had become convinced that his role in this temporal mystery was predetermined, that he had already boarded the flight in some sense and would inevitably do so again. The black box doesn't lie, he insisted. I was on that flight, giving instructions, trying to help, and then saying goodbye. I heard my own voice. The cycle is real, and for whatever reason, I'm part of it. In the weeks leading up to June 7, 2022, we made multiple attempts to contact Keller, but received no response. Dr. Hansen informed us that he had resigned from his position at the NTSB in April and had seemingly disappeared. On June 6th, one day before the scheduled departure of the new Flight 714, we received a package containing a digital recording and a letter from Keller. The The letter explained that he had decided to board the flight, bringing with him specialized equipment designed by Dr. Chen that might help identify and potentially disrupt the temporal anomaly if they encountered it. "I don't expect to return," Keller wrote, "but perhaps I can break the cycle and finally allow Flight 714 and all its passengers to rest. Or perhaps I'm simply fulfilling what has already happened countless times before. Either way, by the time you receive this, I will already be gone." The digital recording included Keller's full account of the investigation, along with his theories about what happened to the original Flight 714 and its subsequent iterations. Most chillingly, it included his own recreation of what he believed happened during the final moments of the flight, based on the fragments he had been able to extract from the black box. According to Keller's reconstruction, Flight 714 encountered the temporal anomaly at approximately 1:15 a.m. on June 8, 1982. The pilots experienced instrument failure, followed by the apparent loss of all fuel, not because the fuel was actually gone, but because the aircraft was beginning to exist in multiple time frames simultaneously, causing readings to fluctuate wildly. As the plane entered the heart of the anomaly, time itself began to distort. The cockpit voice recorder, designed to capture sound linearly, instead captured fragments from multiple iterations of the same event, the crash and the attempts to prevent it, playing out over decades. In at least one of these iterations, a future version of Thomas Keller was aboard, apparently trying to guide the pilots through the anomaly based on knowledge he had gained from previous cycles. "The farewell you hear," Keller explained in the recording, "is me realizing that this attempt has failed, just like previous attempts. I'm saying goodbye because I'm about to try something else, perhaps jumping from the plane into the anomaly itself, or maybe attempting to return to my original time. I don't know yet what I'll do when I'm actually in that situation, but I know I'll be there." The new Southern Atlantic Airways Flight 714 departed Miami International Airport at 11:15 p.m. on June 7, 2022, exactly as scheduled. The Boeing 737, with 163 passengers and 6 crew members, disappeared from radar approximately 140 miles east of Charleston, South Carolina, at 1:17 a.m. No distress signal was received. No wreckage has been found, and on the passenger manifest, just as the mysterious document had indicated, was the name Dr. Thomas Keller. 3 weeks after the disappearance, another unmarked envelope arrived at our office. Inside was a single sheet of paper with typed text that read, "We're still trying." This was the 5th iteration. "I'll find you again before the 6th. It was signed simply TK. The authorities have no explanation for Flight 714's disappearance, and the case remains officially classified as under investigation. When questioned about the original 1982 incident, the FAA and NTSB deny any connection and refuse to comment on what they describe as unsubstantiated conspiracy theories. The military has neither confirmed nor denied the existence of electromagnetic anomalies in the area where both flights disappeared, and all requests for information under the Freedom of Information Act have been denied on grounds of national security. Dr. Eliza Hansen and Dr. Raymond Chen have both reportedly taken leaves of absence from their respective positions and are currently unreachable. As for Thomas Keller, no trace of him exists beyond the passenger manifest and the materials he sent us prior to boarding Flight 714. His voice, warning pilots from a future that has already happened, remains trapped in a black box from 1982. A voice from a time that, in some sense, has not yet occurred. What would you do if you heard your own voice from a future you haven't yet lived? Is Flight 714 still out there, caught in an endless cycle of departure and destruction? Or did Keller finally manage to break the loop? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more investigations into aviation's most disturbing mysteries, the ones they don't want you to know about.